Our next installment of Jews in the Middle Ages, the fourth in our Jewish history crash course, will be Ashkenazic Jewry, the survival and the flourishing of Ashkenazic Jewry. And when we think of Ashkenazic Jewry, we think of Europe. Its origins will be from the Jews in Italy that moved up from Italy into the Rhine Valley, and then up into Germany, France, and eventually England. And Ashkenazic Jewry at this time was really a small population, 20 to 30,000. The geneticists who studied DNA tell us that through mitochondrial DNA, through the mother's DNA, we can trace that European Jewry came from 4 women who moved up into the Rhine Valley, probably around the 8th, 9th century of the Common Era, and then grew from there. And we'll talk about the origins of European Jewry. This will become a matter of debate, even getting into racial identity, but we'll address that later. So the Ashkenazic Jewry in Christian Europe will be very different from the Sephardic experience because the host culture was not one that Jews integrated into in the arts, in politics, in poetry, science, because remember, we're in the Dark Ages. And the culture, such as it was, the educational institutions, the universities were all run by the church, and they were all religious schools. So in the 9th century in France, Charlemagne expanded the French Empire, the French kingdom, to about 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe. And he needed administrators to run his empire. Now, as we mentioned, the educated class were the monks, and there was always a power struggle between the king and the church. So he didn't want to turn there. So who did he turn to? He turned to the Jews of his kingdom, who helped to run his kingdom. So Jews were already achieving positions of importance in early European life. Now, this Ashkenazic Jewry, here we see, we have the privilege of starting to have more visual records. Often the depictions will be around Passover. Why? Because the illustrated manuscripts that Jews made were Haggadahs. So here we see a Passover scene. You notice the men and women together reading in the Seder. You also notice no table, which could have very well been, not just for the picture, but we know that we recline at the Seder. So here we see them reclining. Some of them reclining to the side or back. And here we see a depiction of a Jew blowing a shofar in the Middle Ages. And when we talk about Jewish life, before we talk about anti-Semitism and Christianity, we are going to talk about the area in which Jews did flourish, because if they weren't involved in the culture or in the politics of the time, they dedicated all of their energies and their efforts to Jewish scholarship. That's really where Jews flourished in the Middle Ages. And so you have the greatest figure of Ashkenazi Jewry for perhaps the last 1,000 years was known as Rashi Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. We saw in our page of the Talmud on the right side, the blue column, and that is Rashi's commentary. Rashi wrote a commentary to the entire Talmud, the entire Tanakh, all of the Jewish Bible, and he is the first go-to to understand the basic meaning of the text. And he was from France originally, from Troyes. He moved to Germany to study in Worms. The German community was rooted in Worms, Speins, and Meyer. That's where the great scholars were. I visited Worms, and you can visit. It's really reconstructed because the Nazis destroyed his study hall. But you can visit the Rashi synagogue. What is original is right a few meters away, is an entrance to what looks like a underground subterranean area, and it's the entry to the mikveh with the Jewish ritual bath, which is dug down, stairs going 3 or 4 flights down to the water base where Jews would go immerse themselves. So it's very striking to go there. There's a substantial Jewish cemetery near Worms, which is outside of Frankfurt today in Germany. And there he studied with these great scholars. After 10 years, he returned to France. He was called back to be the rabbi there because his scholarship was recognized in its greatness. And then, right after that, tragically, the First Crusade started to travel across Europe. And all of his teachers were killed, were wiped out. The communities of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, it's believed that perhaps up to 5,000 Jews were killed, 3,000 to 5,000 Jews. And here you have agonizing stories of Jews giving away their lives rather than be forcibly converted. Now, we'll talk about the Crusades in more detail. But first, we need to look at a larger picture of the church in the Middle Ages and Christian anti-Semitism. And I would call this Christian anti-Semitism systemic anti-Semitism, a term which is bandied around a lot today, but we're going to see that, unfortunately, built into the theology of Christianity is the persecution of Jews that went on for 2,000 years. What were those points? So first of all, you have the charge of deicide, that Jews killed Jesus, and so all Jews are guilty by virtue of that. Now, we talked about the death of Jesus last week, killed by the Romans, but the charge was leveled against the Jews who might have given him over to the Romans. A friend of mine was at a cocktail party, and a minister came up to her, and said to her, "How do you feel about the fact that you killed our Lord Jesus?" And I'm not very good on my feet, but she came up with the answer instantly. She says, "Well, it's very unfortunate that one Jew died 2,000 years ago. But how do you feel about the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews who were killed by the church?" And of course, he had no answer for her. So the charge of deicide brought about terrible suffering for Jews. It was often known that on Christmas, Jews did not go out because non-Jews would get drunk and would hunt down Jews to beat them up, or worse, because of their killing of Jesus, who was born on that day, so they say. The next point of built-in Christian anti-Semitism is replacement theology. The book of Jeremiah speaks about a new covenant that will be established between God and the Jewish people. Of course, that's referring to the Messianic era, when there will be a renewal of the relationship between God and all humanity, actually. But the Christians attributed that new covenant to Jesus, who they say through whom all people receive salvation. And how do you know that that is not in fact the case? Well, if Jesus is the Messiah, quite simply, Jewish sources say when the Messiah comes, there will be world peace. And we do not have world peace, so very clearly, the new covenant has not been forged yet. But there was an inconvenience, which is, if this is the new covenant between God and Israel, why are the Jews not recognizing that new covenant and all converting to Christianity? We'll see that it's not due to lack of Christians' efforts to convert us. So the narrative was that God kept the Jews around to be downtrodden, to demonstrate how we've been rejected and how the old covenant has been voided, the covenant between God and the Jewish people from Mount Sinai and from Abraham. And so you have what we would call a self-fulfilling prophecy, that because Jews being downtrodden shows the truth of Christianity, Christians made sure Jews remained downtrodden. And so Jews were banned from many professions, from the guilds in the Middle Ages. Jews could not have Christian servants. And we're going to talk about, of course, the persecution of Jews throughout the Middle Ages. The next point, which was practiced, was the dehumanizing of Jews. Often the association of Jews with the devil and with blood libels. Now, blood libels is its own very strange case study, because the accusation was that Jews use blood of Christian children for their matzah. And what's so strange about that accusation is that, in fact, during the Christian Mass, when they drink the wine, they view the wine not as a symbol of Jesus's blood, but actually the transmutation of Jesus's body into the blood and into the wafer. And another accusation of Jews was desecration of the wafer. And there are pictures showing Jews with spears stabbing the wafer, which would have been the body of Jesus. And this caused terrible suffering, to the point where in Jewish legal texts, it says on Passover, if you're going to be in danger by using red wine and be accused, use white wine instead, so there will be no accusation. And part of the dehumanizing, if we look to the left, the picture of what is called the Judensau, which is the Jews suckling from the pig. And of course, pork being anathema to Jews, it's particularly demeaning, was meant to be demeaning to Jews. And the Jews suckling from the pig was also, as I said, a level of dehumanization. Some of these are still on the cathedrals in Germany. And of course, today there are debates about whether we remove offensive names, imagery, statues, and especially with the cancel culture. I believe what's done is that a plaque was put on the side of the church saying that these were anti-Semitic images that were propagated in the Middle Ages, and of course, using it as the teaching moment to show that this has been renounced today. The other systemic anti-Semitism occurred in your Middle Ages society, which was Jews being in positions of being the middlemen, sometimes as tax collectors for the king, because Jews were the subjects of the kings. And you did have situations where often the kings would protect the Jews against the mobs. But who do you like less than the person who's calling you to get you to pay up on your loan? Of course, they understood. Now, how did this develop? Because biblical law says that you should not lend to your neighbor, to your fellow countrymen. So Jews are not allowed, with interest, Jews are not allowed to take interest from another Jew. And in fact, Christians adopted this, that Christians cannot take interest from another Christian. And so they, in fact, wanted Jews in this role because they started to understand that loans actually are ways of growing businesses and growing the economy even of an area. But Jews were put in an unfortunate position. Jews were often, as well, tax collectors, because if you're going to have someone within your own community collect taxes, they're going to have a break to all their friends. Jews were the outsiders, and I guess the ruling kings and nobles felt that the Jews would actually be more objective in collecting the taxes. So these are some of the intrinsic anti-Semitic aspects of the society. And of course, this was renounced by the Second Vatican Council in 1964. And the church has changed, the Christian world has changed. Many view the Holocaust as really the culmination of 1,000 years of virulent anti-Semitism and persecution. And even though it was executed by atheistic Nazis and Germans. It was carried out by all the populations in Europe as well. It would not have happened had not the local populations, and those populations, of course, were brought up on anti-Semitism. Vatican II changed it, and it took time, it took decades for the attitudes to change. And the Vatican is still ambivalent about Israel in many different ways, but overall, one can say that the church has radically changed and has successfully changed its theology to not castigate Jews and to not promote anti-Semitism. Now it's promoted in other ways, and perhaps from the leftover attitudes. You see on the left, this statue, these two statues, are on the front of Notre Dame de Paris, a favorite tourist spot from all over the world. People come to see this structure, and yet right there on the front is the picture on the right of the church standing tall and proud and strong, and on the left, the synagogue spurned, blinded by the hat, shoulders down, and turned away. So paradoxically, on the same church front are depictions of the kings of Israel, because they traced Jesus's line back to the kings of Judah. But so those Jews are found in favor, but the synagogue is depicted in this way. And unfortunately, the symbols of anti-Semitism abounded. Here on the left, you see a picture of a Jew being struck, and the yellow emblem on their clothes, here it looks like it's the tablets of the commandments. It's not clear. Later, of course, it became a Jewish star. Jews often had to wear pointed hats, which in some ways were demeaning. I'm not sure what the red on the side of the face is here. Is that blood? It's not clear. But as you see, in the art of the period, you see this depicted. Here you have Jewish moneylenders, which we talked about, lending money to Christians. And now we're going to have to talk about the Crusades, because even though there were blood libels already in England before the Crusades, and the massacre of the Jews of Leeds, which has been actually, the graves were found recently as they were digging a parking lot. So there was already terrible persecution in England. But the Crusades were initiated, the first crusade in 1092, to go retake the Holy Land, Israel, from the infidel. Who is the infidel? The Muslim. And even though that was the goal, remember, these were large hordes of people, often popular people who were the downtrodden parts of society and found glory and maybe even, they hoped, wealth by pillaging and making war. And the movement of tens of thousands of people would take months and months and months to get to the Holy Land. So you can imagine that they were frustrated, and along the way, they took out their violence against the Jews. And we talked about the destruction of Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, and numerous other cities where Jews were attacked, not just in the first Crusades, but in multiple Crusades after that as well. Now, we have more anti-Semitism. The burning of the Talmud in 1240 in Paris. And we mentioned Rashi, who passed away in 1104. And he was succeeded by his grandsons and his students, who developed a whole school of Talmudic study, which is studied to this day. On the left of the Talmud is the commentary of the Tosfot, which means simply additions. And if Rashi is a Roman commentary, the Tosfot were more of an analytic style. They would say, well, you're making this point in the Talmud here. What about this other point which contradicts in the Talmud somewhere else? And then through the resolution, they would get a deeper understanding. So it was the dialectic method. And that school of study flourished for some 100 years, 130 years. But in the 1240, the church convened a disputation, a public debate between Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and Pablo Cristiani, who was a Jewish convert to Christianity. And, it was Nicholas Donin. And in the process, or as an aftermath, 24 cartloads of Jewish holy books were destroyed, were burnt. And this some attribute to the fact that around then, the school of the Tosafot started to decline. And it could simply have been they didn't have enough books to study from. You also had, and this coupled with the Black Death in the 1380s saw less Jews dying than Christians. The accusation was of Jews either poisoning the wells or colluding with the devil. Of course, if you understand that Jews have a religious practice of washing our hands every morning when we wake up, before we eat any meal, after going to the bathroom, you understand that germs would have spread less in the Jewish community. We also have a very strong custom of burying the dead to prevent, and bodies, of course, decaying bodies spread the disease at an incredible rate. So here you have in Strasbourg, a beautiful historical town, which today still has much of its medieval look, but the terrible burning of Jews in that persecution. And there's a backstory to this, a Jewish backstory, which, in order to understand it, we turn to another great figure who is, in a sense, a bridge between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jewry. And that great figure is none other than Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. He has a picture of his seal, which was found in Israel. We'll talk about him going to Israel. But he lived in northeastern Spain, in Gerona, which is near Barcelona. And he was a figure which was part of Spanish Jewry, but after the Reconquest. So he had a great respect for the Spanish tradition of philosophy and study, and cites and uses Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, which Maimonides wrote at the end of his life, some 50 years before Nachmanides. But Nachmanides had studied with the Ashkenazi rabbis from northern France. So he knew both communities. Now, what happened was a dispute broke out between the rabbis of Spain and the rabbis of France. The rabbis of France said that Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed should not be studied. Why? Because it was a book of philosophy. And it questioned, how do we believe in God? How do we prove our belief in God? How do we prove God's omnipotence and omniscience? And the rabbis of France felt that why open up such questions? And in fact, it was dangerous to do so. And so they banned Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. The Spanish rabbis were incensed. They counterbanned the rabbis of France. This battle went on, and particularly in southern France, it got particularly heated because both populations lived there, in Provence. And Maimonides' uncle, Rabbi Yonah, who was himself a great scholar, led the movement against Maimonides. And they went to the church and they said, do you realize the blasphemy that is written in these books? And the church burned these books. And this was perhaps the first instance of book burning. Rabbeinu Yonah realized how terrible it was that they'd instigated this. And he tried to do repentance. He wrote an entire book, Ala Tshuva, as repentance for this wrongdoing. But many attribute the direct line from the Jews bringing on Christians to burn Jewish books, to Christians burning Jewish books themselves, and then Christians burning Jews. So, terrible chapter in Jewish history. Let's return to a discussion, a movement we mentioned before of the Crusades going to Israel. First Crusade in 1092 and culminating in 1095 with Christians arriving in the Holy Land. And this is our way to understand, to talk about what was going on in the Middle Ages in Israel itself. Now, even though we said the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem, had salted the land, there were still some communities that survived. We have travelogues of Jewish travelers who talked about communities in the Galilee that survived. Sometimes 30 to 50 families, maybe a dozen such communities. It wasn't large, but it was significant. And these communities lived under Islamic rule. And the Jews, when the Crusades started to attack, defended their cities with the Muslims, fought alongside them, and were killed alongside them as well by the Crusades. But the Crusaders will establish their bulkhead in Akko, and here you have a picture of the Knights Hall in Akko, and if you haven't been there, it's definitely worth seeing. There are these massive halls, a 2-kilometer underground secret tunnel going from their castle to the port, the enormous walls of the city, and paradoxically, there was a thriving Jewish community in Akko, starting in the 1200s. There was 300 French, it says rabbis, maybe they weren't all rabbis, but a community of 300 that moved to Israel. Many of them went to Jerusalem, but in the 1220s, the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed. They were invading hordes from the east, and the Muslims took back over from the Christians, and many of that community retreated to Akko, where you had Sephardic Jews who had been living in Israel at the time, and you had Ashkenazic Jews all living together. And for most of the time, they got along quite well. And the paradox was that the Jews in Akko and in the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem were by and large much better off than on the mainland of Europe, where there were decrees against the Jews. And as we said, book burnings and pogroms and papal decrees, persecutions of the Jews. In Akko, the Crusaders needed the local population. It's estimated there might have been some 120,000 Europeans and 300,000 Orientals and other Jews living there. So they were needed by the population, and so it was actually a period of relative calm. And there were other waves of immigration. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris set out for Israel in the 1250s, actually some 10, 15 years after the disputation. Let's turn back to Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who, as I mentioned, got involved in the fight over Maimonides' books. And what he said in the end was, in good Talmudic form, really the rabbis of France and the rabbis of Spain are both right. For the rabbis of France who live in a culture that doesn't have philosophy and they're not integrated into the host culture, they don't need philosophy to answer these questions. But the Jews of Spain who are living in an open society needed this work. And so he said that they should find a way to accept each other's disagreements. in southern France, where both populations live, they would just both have to live with those differences. And by and large, it succeeded. And Nachmanides was a young 35 years old when he brokered this peace, so to speak. He himself was very close and on good terms with the royalty in Barcelona, King James of Aragon, and was the head rabbi of the court of Barcelona. But even there, the church exerted its power and pressured the king into a disputation, another public debate, which was called between a Jewish apostate, public Christianity, and Nachmanides. And before that, the church sent priests to go into the synagogues to preach Christianity. They saw none of the Jews were buying it. They did this public debate, which had several rounds, lasted over a week. And it's not clear exactly how it unfolded. We do have Nachmanides' transcription, which he wrote down a year later. What we do know is that King James remunerated him as he had promised, and he praised him for his truthfulness. He couldn't actually say that Nachmanides' arguments were stronger, but as a result, the church was incensed when Nachmanides came out with his version. They came out with the Latin version, which was, of course, very different. But in the end, what happened was that the church pressured the king he had to issue a banishment, that Nachmanides would have to go and leave Spain. And so in the end of his life, he followed the roots of the Crusades. And what's so interesting is that the Jews, seeing the Crusades, must have asked themselves, these Christians are traveling to Israel. It's really our homeland. There's a mitzvah to be in Israel, a commandment to live in the Holy Land, and we want to fulfill that. And so not just that the routes of sailing were open, but the Christians themselves were an example and maybe an embarrassment for the Jews, that they were moving and not more Jews weren't. So you had this movement in the early 1210s, 300 Jews. You had subsequent waves. And Nachmanides, when he was banished, he could have gone to France. He could have gone to where his teachers were. But he chose to move to the land of Israel. And so in the end of his life, in 1265, he arrives in Israel, and he describes going to Jerusalem and finding it decimated by all of by then, decades of fighting between Christians and Muslims and Eastern hordes. And he describes how he got to Jerusalem before the high holidays. There was no community, there was no synagogue. So he cleared out a hall, and he established a synagogue where there were 2 stone pillars in the synagogue. And they reestablished the minyan, which would be the reestablishment of Jewish life in Jerusalem. And this really is a testimony to the fact that Zionism is not a 19th century phenomenon. Jews were moving to Zion, making their way to Israel throughout the centuries, throughout the diaspora, throughout all of their exile. And here we see on the right, incredible find of the seal Moshe bar Rav Nachman Migorona Hagurundi Chazak, which means may be strong. And this was found outside of Akko, where he lived. He did not stay in Jerusalem. He went back to Akko. There were academies there. There were other rabbis there. And he must have thrived in that environment in the end of his life. He wrote additions to his commentary where he talks about experiences of being in Israel, of seeing how large a shekel actually is, because there were historic coins that were found, talking about distances of the geography of Israel. And so it really comes to life in his commentary on the Torah. And he would die in 1270 and live the rest of his years in Israel. Now, tragically, the Maimonidean dispute broke out again in the 1280s in Akko, perhaps once again because you had both populations living near each other. And a few years later, the Muslims would reconquer all of Israel, kick out the Crusades, but in the process of the destruction of Akko, many of the Jews who lived there were killed. And so you had terrible destruction on the aftermath of Jewish infighting, once again, echoing the teaching of the Talmud that the temple was destroyed because of needless hatred between Jews. And unfortunately, these patterns reoccurred, often leading to great tragedy. Now, the 13th and 14th and 15th century in Europe will see terrible persecution. And France, you can see here, the Jews were kicked out in 1182. How were they kicked out again? So Saint Louis, Louis IX, who is pictured over the burning of the books, there he is on the left, he was canonized. But this king perpetrated terrible persecution against the Jews. He invited the Jews back. Why? Because he realized the Jews had all these outstanding loans that he wanted to collect. He invited the Jews back, told them they'd get 20 cents on the dollar. They collected the loans, which then became his assets, and then kicked the Jews out again. And Jews were kicked out of England in 1290. Here you see Germany, 1100s, 1348, kicked out, 1510. Austria, 1421. My mother was from Austria, from Salzburg, and my great-great-grandparents resettled Salzburg in the 1860s. Why? Because Jews had been kicked out in the 1420s. Hungary, and of course, the great expulsion from Spain in 1492. And this was really the culmination of the expulsion of Jews from Spain, and we'll pick up again. Where did the Jews go? How did they survive? And where did they find refuge? The Jewish populations will start moving east in Europe, where, of course, they will spend the next 500 years.